Late last week, I had the chance to head up to the Rainy River with my good buddy Brett McComas to chase down some early season walleyes. Now, this is a really fun bite and it can be really popular this time of year. As soon as the accesses break open and people can start bringing big boats up, they come up in droves. You know, you hear stories all the time of guys who have to walk 1.5 miles down the road to park their rig after they launch their boat. So it's one of those deals where it can be really popular. It kind of reminds me of that early season Red Lake bite here in Minnesota. As soon as guys find out that there's good ice up on Red Lake, you see them coming up like crazy, and that's the same thing with this Rainy River bite. So I was excited to get up there before the crowds. This was late last week. Me and Brett McComas went up, and it was just, you know, a day or two after the ramp was broken free so you can launch a big boat, and the bite was really fun. And here's a quick look at my first walleye, open water walleye of the 2021 season.
There we go.
Ooh, nice one. There we have it. First walleye of the open water season. So right now we are on the Rainy River. It is Thursday and we are out here on open water. We are in the big boat, so we're not sneaking out over you know, with the John boat over the ice. We launched the big boat. Water temperatures are about 35 degrees and we are on the board with an awesome walleye. All right, I'm gonna get this one back in the water and we're gonna catch some more. So I talked a little bit about water temperature, but two factors that I think are a little bit more important this time of year on this particular system is number one, the water clarity, and number two, the amount of current that happens to be ripping through the system at that point in time. And as far as water clarity goes, we're looking at right around 2 feet of visibility, which to me is just perfect when you're out fishing on the Rainy River this time of year. It's not too muddy, it's not too clear. These are perfect feeding conditions for walleyes in that system. And as far as the current goes, there really wasn't a lot of it, which was really nice as far as fishing conditions goes. It makes it super easy to fish lighter jigs. So we were fishing up shallow. I'll talk a little bit about our presentation where we were fishing later in this video, but we were fishing up shallow and we were able to use really light jigs thanks to the little amount of current that was coming through. And it also made boat control really pretty simple, pretty easy, because, you know, we didn't have to have our trolling motor ripped up to 10 the whole time just to stay in place. So these were some great conditions up on the river, and yeah, if they continue to hold like this, the bite is gonna be really good for weeks to come.
Oh, I'm gonna fish?
Yeah. Man, she looks too chunky to boat flip.
Boat flipper thing.
No.
Yeah, that one looks a little bit much.
We're doing it. We're doing it. All right. Another Walter.
Instead of digging through my tackle boxes.
Yeah. Check it out. A little bit smaller than the last one, but we're out here catching fish. It's open water. Super awesome. All I'm throwing right now is just a super tiny little 1/8 ounce jig with a 4-inch impulse smelt minnow, which is just, you know, a little straight tail plastic. And all I'm doing is casting it out and just dragging it back to the boat, and we're catching some pretty solid fish. This one is not as chunky as the last one. So now that you know what I was throwing, let's take a closer look at how I like to work the bait. So as far as like the presentation goes, it's really pretty basic when you're fishing in this really cold water. You know, a lot of guys are gonna wanna use meat, you know, whether that's minnows, shiners, salties, any of that. But right now I'm actually just fishing just a standard kind of straight tail minnow plastic. Like I said, we're fishing pretty darn shallow, so I'm fishing an 1/8 ounce jig. If I wanted to fish a paddle tail in these same situations, I'd probably bump it up to a 1/4 ounce, or, you know, just something a little bit heavier for a bulkier presentation that has a little bit more drag in the water. But regardless, the presentation, no matter what bait you're gonna be doing, is gonna be pretty similar, and that's keeping it pretty close to the bottom, dragging it across the bottom, maybe giving it a few pops. The amount of action you give the bait is just going to depend on the mood of the fish, and the mood of the fish is usually dictated by water temperature and current situations, and you know, in a lot of cases also water clarity as well. But as this water continues to warm up and conditions continue to improve, you know, over the course of several days or even over the course of today, you know, as the sun is up in the sky, it's pretty warm out, the water temps are going to continue to increase today, and as they do increase, in theory you should be able to fish a little bit more aggressively and still get bites. So that's kind of where we're at right now. But you know, all the bites I've got, like I said, have just been slowly hopping it across the bottom. I'm ticking bottom every now and then. Now, sticking to the topic of presentation, here's a closer look at the bait that I was using. So right here, it's just a simple jig and plastic setup. As you can see, I have a little 1/8 ounce deep V jig, which is a newer jig from Northland, and I got it paired up with a 4-inch impulse smelt minnow, which is my absolute go-to fluke style plastic. And yeah, this deep V jig is really cool. It's got a little bit of a longer shank, and it also has a skinnier pill shape, aspirin shape head, which allows it to cut through the current a little bit better. This is gonna be one of my go-to river jigs this year for sure, just because it cuts current, and it also has a really good action when you're popping this bait up through the water. So this is gonna be a go-to, and I also think it's gonna probably end up flying off the shelves. So a couple other jig options that you're gonna wanna look at when you're out river fishing up on the Rainy is, number one, of course, the long shank fireball jig. Now, this is gonna be a go-to, of course, when you're fishing shiners, but it's also a great plastics jig as well, because it has that extra long shank there, which is perfect paired up with plastics, because you get that hook a little bit further back, and it also has a bait keeper as well. So this is one of my go-to jigs when I'm chasing walleyes, whether I'm, you know, using live bait or plastic. So this is a really good option if you can't find any of the deep V jigs, and you know, if they happen to sell out at retail. Another good option as well is just a hair jig. This one right here is the deep V bucktail jig, and it's exactly what the name suggests. It's got the deep V jig head, and it's tied up with some bucktail on the back, and this is a really good option for walleyes in the spring as well, just because when the bite is hot and heavy, it's nice to not have to deal with either live bait or plastics. So you just take this thing, you throw it out there, you work it just like you would a normal jig, and it gets bit. And hair, for whatever reason, is just absolutely killer in river fishing situations. And the more that I talk about it and the more that I think about it, I probably should have been throwing this bait a little bit more out on this last trip up to the Rainy. Now, another good option on the plastic side of things is a paddle tail. This one right here is the impulse paddle minnow. This is my go-to for walleyes, especially early in the season like this. Electric chicken, of course, is one of my favorite colors, but as a rule of thumb, if I'm fishing like an 1/8 ounce jig when I'm using one of these straight tail plastics, if I'm using a paddle tail, I will upsize my jig head one size. So if I'm using an 1/8 ounce, I will use a 1/4 ounce when I'm using a paddle tail, just because that tail, when it's kicking through the water on the fall, will actually slow down your fall quite a bit. So the paddle tail is another really cool option. Kicking action, something a little bit different for the walleyes to look at. You know, if you're fishing live bait, it's tough to beat your classic fireball jig. That's another one of my favorites. Also, when you're fishing river situations, sometimes the Whistler jig can be a go-to. So obviously it's got that propeller. When you're fishing in the current, this thing is pretty much always spinning. So it gives you a little bit something different, a little bit more vibration when the walleyes are looking at your jig trying to track it down. So the Whistler is another great option. Now, another bait that I wish I would have threw more while I was up there is the new Northland Rumble Shiner. Now, for whatever reason, the Rainy River just tends to be a really jig-heavy fishery. Whenever people go up there, they just bust out the jigs, either plastics or meat, and they cast it out and they just drag it across the bottom. And you know, that definitely works. I can tell you right now that that works, but I can also tell you that those walleyes will be more than happy to crank a hard bait that's ripping across their face. So what's cool about this bait is that it's really easy to use. You can just cast it out there and you just reel it back. You can give it a couple pumps if you want to, but You know, when you put a nice balsa bait like this in front of a fish, it's got that lifelike wiggle. They're gonna absolutely smack it, I can promise you. So that is another option while you're up there on the Rainy River. The sun is like, I don't know, maybe like 30 minutes away from hitting the horizon. And we're gonna probably try to not load up the boat here in the dark. But we are gonna fish a little bit longer. See if we can knock a couple more before the sun goes down. But speaking of that, there's another one. Right. Not a big one, but another open water walleye. This one has some nasty growths on its side. But yeah, the biggest key for us today is once we got right up on that current seam, that's when we started catching fish, and you can visually see it on the surface, especially on a nice calm day like this. You can see the current seams, and that's where we've had a lot of success today. Also worth noting, there were a lot of guys catching fish in the deep river channels in that like 10-foot range, give or take a couple feet, and they were having some success as well. We opted to fish a little bit shallower, up near like 5 foot of water, give or take a couple feet, and we were just pitching up. We were out set up a little bit deeper. We were pitching out up top and fishing up in shallow water. What that allowed us to do was to use these lighter jigs and baits that have slower drop speed, and I believe that probably helped us catch a few more fish. So that's something to keep in mind. But if you're able to get up to the Rainy River, or I guess down to the Rainy River if you're in Canada, if you're able to get to the Rainy River, you're gonna find fish all over the place, shallow, deep, but it's just a matter of experimenting throughout the day and finding where you're gonna find more fish, and even bigger fish too, because it's fun to catch bigger fish, right? So test a bunch of things, try a bunch of different baits, try shallow, try deep, and experiment till you find the mother lode of walleyes, because there are a ton of them right now in the Rainy River. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you learned something, make sure to hit that little red subscribe button down below. And until next time, we'll see you on the next video.